He holds bachelor's and master's degrees in archaeology from BYU, a master's degree in meteorology from the California Institute of Technology, and a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Los Angeles. He originated the program in anthropology at BYU, heading it for 14 of his 24 years of faculty service. His primary academic and professional emphasis was in sociocultural anthropology, including many years as an applied anthropologist. Among other positions, he served as Director of Social Sciences at General Research Corporation in Santa Barbara, California in the late 1960s, and later founded Bonneville Research Corporation in Provo, Utah. He is the author of more than 200 publications. Despite following a variety of other professional interests throughout his career, Dr. Sorenson never lost his strong interest in Mesoamerican archaeology, the subject that first drew him to anthropology. Since his retirement in BYU from 1986, he has concentrated his research and writing in that area. One of the key figures in the early development of the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, now part of the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, Dr. Sorenson served for several years as editor of its journal, Book of Mormon Studies. His 1985 book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, published by Farms and Deseret Book, has become the most influential treatment of Book of Mormon peoples and histories in their Mesoamerican context. Dr. Sorenson and his late wife, Catherine, reared 9 children. In 1993, he married Helen Lance Christensen, mother of 9. They reside in Provo, Utah. And then he's obviously written a number of books that you can pick up at the Fair Bookstore. I know that several people with Fair say that their lives have been influenced by Dr. Sorenson. So, welcome.
We've been treated today to several good stories, and they, I think, make a presentation worthwhile. I'm not sure that I have an entrancing story to tell you, but it will be a story of sorts, and it may provide some perspective of a certain value. I'm concerned with the study of Book of Mormon studies, the field of work that can be called Book of Mormon studies. However, we might just as well say church history studies or any other field of study. I think there's merit and potential benefit in performing studies in which we use the tools and materials of scholarship, or science, if you wish, to shed new light, to illuminate and broaden our understanding of various fields of activity. What I call Book of Mormon studies has not really been considered a distinct domain of scholarship very often. I think it is becoming such, increasingly recognized as such, and what I have to say in the way of the history of that activity will, I think, show why it is becoming a more prominent field of study. The text of the Book of Mormon, I would say, together with the data concerning its coming forth and its influence, everything about the Book of Mormon, constitutes a largely unexplored body of phenomena that deserves analysis and interest. The task is generally of the same nature as, say, the physical structure of an unexplored region to which geologists may begin to direct their attention. What the geologist does is to take what he knows that has clarified the geological structure of some other area and plops it down on the new area that he wishes to shed light on. A transfer of method and ideas. In either case, what one wishes to see done is to make sense of the phenomena. The geologist wants to make sense of the area that he has begun to examine. Studying, carrying on what can be called Book of Mormon studies also has the intent of providing more light, making sense of the Book of Mormon. Of course, in the early days of the church, those interested in the Book of Mormon made sense of the volume in one of two possible ways, neither of which more than skirted what can be considered scholarly study in that day. In the case of believers in the authenticity of the book, at best, what they did was to borrow informally from early 19th century Protestant interpretations of biblical history and textual interpretation. They took a Protestant position and plopped that down on the Book of Mormon. So their first concerns in Book of Mormon study were to show that the Protestant biblical positions agreed with the Book of Mormon ones, and that therefore the Book of Mormon was sound, correct, and so was the Bible. That's not a lot of new light. They were confirming what they already believed. And those who doubted the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, made sense of it by assuming that the Book of Mormon was fraudulent. They assumed that there were internal and external inconsistencies that would confirm their opinion in the same way that other fraudulent documents could be detected by inconsistencies. Through the early decades of the church's history, the only alternative view to the one I've outlined was an unorganized attempt to correlate the cultural and geographical characteristics mentioned in the book with corresponding facts from the New World. In 1844, in Nauvoo, the recently popular book published by John Lloyd Stevens, Incidents of Travel in Central America and so on, was used by some church leaders to try to demonstrate that the Book of Mormon made sense as an historical account of ancient American civilization. Stevens had just reported in his book the discovery of the great Mayan ruins. Not much came of this effort in Nauvoo because none of the saints had mastered the content of scholarship. At that time, that consisted of very little except Stevens' book. But they didn't know enough to do more than make a rather odd stab at a correlation between Stevens' World of Ruins and the Book of Mormon account. Aside from that one brief instance to provide an external context for the book, no other attempts, LDS or non-LDS, that displayed scholarly knowledge appeared for many years. One reason, obviously, was in pioneer times there was no time for any version of scholarship, nor was there, in fact, any scholarship outside that was relevant. Serious efforts of a scholarly nature to shed light on the Book of Mormon began with three men: Sidney Sperry, Wells Jakeman, and Hugh Nibley. Their preparation to do work in this field had to wait until there were opportunities for employment. First of all, opportunities in higher education for exposure to the tools of scholarship, and then for them to occupy their time employed in an employed status doing scholarship that related to the Book of Mormon. Sperry's master's thesis at the University of Chicago in 1926 addressed the relationship between the Book of Mormon and the quotations therein from the prophet Isaiah. It represented the first attempt to examine the Book of Mormon text using the methods of a scholar. Some of B.H. Roberts' probings around that time approached a level of scholarship, but lacked the depth to cross the threshold to genuine scholarly work. Jakeman, with a PhD in ancient history, began publishing as early as 1938 on possible correlations between Book of Mormon features and Mesoamerican cultures. Nibley's orientation to study of the Book of Mormon came a decade later. There were a few others who, although they were not prepared in professional scholarship and did not have professional positions, still proved on special topics to make contributions that were not trivial. It may be noted that the stimuli for most Book of Mormon studies up until the 1970s and 80s were topics or problems, quotes, raised by non-scholarly, anti-Book of Mormon critics. They raised the problems, we tended to respond. But increasingly over the last 40 years, original questions have more often been addressed. Topics that have seemed worth intellectual probing for their own sakes, rather than as responses to criticism. For instance, my own work on Mesoamerican geographical and cultural context for the Nephites has never been prompted by the concerns of critics. Probably the most influential original study in the early period of this growth was Jack Welch's recognition of the chiasmus literary style. By the present day, most Book of Mormon scholarship is pursued without regard to whether anti-Mormons raise the issues or not. The pioneering efforts had only limited effect upon Latter-day Saints because of lack of publishing outlets. Up until about 1950, I believe that all scholarly Book of Mormon studies that were of permanent value could have been accommodated on a shelf no more than 3 feet long. Lack of publishing outlets depended in turn on the lack of readers, or more realistically, the lack of book buyers. As the number of graduates from church educational institutions increased in subsequent decades, however, not only has scholarly literacy grown in the reader community, but also the economic means in the hands of a growing number of readers has spurred further publishing of serious Book of Mormon studies. Those who have memory enough of an older day may just cast your minds back on what the fair bookstore would have looked like in 1950. Probably one small desk is all that would have been required. Our perspectives on the trajectory of Book of Mormon research can be better focused by citing examples, but let me pause to say a word about why I use the term trajectory. I suppose that there is a path, a definite path, almost a life history, growth, birth, growth, on to maturity, and that Book of Mormon studies are on that trajectory or that path, growing toward maturity. I don't think it's mature yet. It may be adolescent, but it's definitely beyond childhood. And I think when I was referring to the three fathers, Sperry, Jakeman, and Nibley, they were close to the birth of genuine scholarship. Each of the cases that or incidents, examples that I'm going to give, has significance in that it illustrates the use of a novel concept or analytical tool to the Book of Mormon case. That is, in each case, the author of the study has taken a notion, a tool, or a set of ideas that has been successful in treating the Iliad, or the Bible, or English literature, or whatever, some other area, and it seems to shed light. And they say, if we applied that to the Book of Mormon, would we also get light? Yes. It's all borrowing. Few or none of us ever invent entirely new tools or concepts. Our strength and the strength and utility of all scholarship or science is borrowing. and adapting effectively whatever means have proved useful elsewhere. Here are selected examples that could easily be multiplied. When I started to list the possibilities initially, it was easy to get up to 50, 75 cases, so I've just selected a few arbitrarily. Case, word print studies. They were first used to examine issues of disputed scholarship in secular literature, Shakespearean studies and whatnot. John Hilton was one of the first to realize the potential of this tool for examining the question of who wrote the Book of Mormon. Since then, there have been, of course, further studies. Wells Jakeman first suggested in 1952 that volcanoes in Central America, could explain aspects of the Great Destruction of 3rd Nephi. Subsequently, geologists Koalas and Bayer, among others, have expanded on that notion and have been able to take advantage of data from an increasing number of cases known from history and archaeology. Another case, once there was, among Latter-day Saints, only general recognition of and commentary on the religious significance of King Benjamin's sermon. Then Nibley, followed by Ricks and others, saw value in adapting the model of the coronation of Israelite and other Near Eastern monarchs and applying that to the coronation of Mosiah. And they learned some important things about the Benjamin incident by borrowing from the tradition in Near Eastern regal studies. And this has led them to consideration of other festivals and ceremonial occasions in the ancient Near East that also are reflected in the Book of Mormon. At one time, the olive tree in the Book of Mormon was a subject only for doctrinal and historical discussion, but now Jacob's allegory of the olive tree has become a substantial subfield of interest in which an interesting variety of scholars have worked. Sperry originally conceived of and termed 2 Nephi 4 the Psalm of Nephi. Later scholars such as Rust, Perry, and Angela Kroll have had much more to say about this passage and about many other instances of poetry in the Book of Mormon in light of scholarly studies of Hebrew literature. Now, a great deal is known, but by no means exhausted, about poetry in the Book of Mormon. Nibley was effectively the first to recognize that ethnographic, descriptive, people descriptive, and historical parallels drawn from studies on the Near East, both ancient and modern, are found in 1 Nephi's description of Nephi's report. This is one of the largest subfields of Book of Mormon studies, and it shows no signs of having been exhausted. There's a long history of misguided Latter-day Saint claims for parallels between archaeology and the Native American historical traditions on the one hand, and the Nephite record on the other, starting with the interpreting of Stephen's book in Nauvoo over 160 years ago. All of those suggestions have proved badly flawed. Only in the last few decades has LDS students' mastery of the complex literature, the reports of the anthropology of ancient America, been sufficient to justify applying usefully archaeological and ethnographic models to Book of Mormon studies. Textual study of the Book of Mormon that began as early as Thomas Brookbank has been greatly increased to culminate so far in the work of Royal Skousen. But I think he would be the first to recognize that he has not done all the work there is to be done. Nibley's first identification of Egyptian proper names in the Book of Mormon has been expanded as others have continued the search in Near Eastern languages, and the end has been by no means reached yet. Starting with Sperry's handful of examples, the identified Hebraisms in the text of the Book of Mormon by now number hundreds. Surely others will be located and analyzed as time goes on. There are many more, and I will not cite very many of them. A couple, though. Brian Stubbs' development of a massive database in the Uto-Aztecan languages has revealed that Hebrew languages at one time in ancient America hybridized with at least one Mexican family of tongues. Repetitive use of his tools promises to allow documentation of the same hybridizing phenomenon involving other New World languages. One area that I find begun, but barely, is the study of Nephite religion. I do not mean Nephite doctrine as interpreted from the point of view of the Restoration. I mean religion as it was experienced by the Nephites. We do not read the Book of Mormon in those terms. We tend to think, well, the Nephites pretty much thought the way we do, they just didn't have the language we have. Well, there's a little that has been done. One of the most interesting is Dan Peterson's treatment of Nephi's Asherah. He finds in Nephi's texts the existence of the same female divinity that has been proposed in research on the Jewish cult. Well, rather than try to explain that further, I'll just note that we have much to do to try to shed light from the fields of religious studies and textual studies and biblical studies over to make more sense of Nephite religion. But as the years have gone by and scholarly study and publishing on the Book of Mormon has increased, several dimensions of the process of that increase have become apparent. Together, they permit us to project some future changes. Here are trends I believe I detect in that trajectory of studies. There are 7 of them. They overlap to some degree, but not entirely. The first point, naive writings and thought that merely accepted notions that were common in the church about the worlds in which the Book of Mormon peoples lived have tended to be replaced by ideas that are more critical and analytical, from naivety to analytical and critical thought. The second point, questions that were formerly mainly apologetic or defensive against the challenges of critics over time have tended to be superseded by more original queries, as I indicated above. The third point, systematic, exhaustive studies tend to substitute for random probings. At one time, a bright idea was enough to think somebody should say something new about the Book of Mormon. Now we tend to feel one must at least see what everyone else has said on the subject first, and then perhaps to combine our efforts with someone else's efforts. Standalone or one-shot research results are likely to become part of a cumulative body of findings. Book of Mormon studies consist not just of one item, 2 items, 3 items, 4 items, but a cumulative body that is more and more integrated or interrelated. Works that are based in a single discipline, academic field, or those that use only a single research tool tend to be replaced by contributions of wider scope that combine the methods and findings of multiple fields, methods, and specialists. Sixth, lone wolf scholars tend to become rarer. Their place has been taken increasingly by study teams or cooperative groups that by sharing their findings, advance farther and faster. And seventh, adequate public level communication of results becomes more difficult or unlikely as the complexity of the results increases. In other words, it's harder to get a handle for the public on what is being done, what has been done, because it's just harder to talk about. There's more, and there's more complexity. These tendencies have precise parallels when the field of the history of ideas, or intellectual history, looks at any field of research. For example, in astronomy, there was a time when the only real tool was eyeballing the heavenly bodies through a lens. When the use of radio detection of stars became available, the field of astronomy greatly expanded, both in capabilities and in findings. And there are, of course, other such tools. Another instance, the use of global positioning systems has revolutionized the discipline of geography and the range of questions that it can successfully ask and answer. Again, the use of more innovative and large-scale computer information systems has had profound consequences for several fields of study. One of them has been multispectral imaging, pioneered by Stephen Boris and others at Farms in analyzing the Dead Sea Scrolls, and now since then in other documents. Having the new tools means new things, new questions can be addressed successfully. The trajectory I see ahead for Book of Mormon studies has a number of significant components, but they may be disturbing. The first is we need very much to ask and pursue better questions, keener, less naive, more productive of work. The second point is that we need more researchers, more minds who can borrow a greater variety of useful paradigms, tools, schemes of thought that have not previously been used in Book of Mormon studies. In fact, we need more minds to provide alternative perspectives on the questions that have long been around. Are there no new ideas to be thought of in regard to Isaiah in the Book of Mormon? Surely the last word has not been said. But more minds do not mean naive minds. Whoever will provide new and productive results must become thoroughly conversant with the best of what has been done. To do that, they must read all of the relevant literature, all of it. Unfortunately, in the field of Book of Mormon studies, there are not many good tools to allow that to be done well. For instance, when one consults the comprehensive bibliography on the Book of Mormon, prepared for Farms by Perry, Miller, and Thorne, my examination indicates that at least 95% of the sources cited there are of literally no value to mature scholarship. They're passé, except for a few. This does not mean that earlier students should be disrespected. They did the best they could, but they had limited tools with limited results. It seems unlikely that for the foreseeable future there will be much increase in the number of professional, or at least professorial, researchers on Book of Mormon topics. So there's a great need for avocational scholars, amateurs, if you will, ones who don't get paid for doing it. And at their best, these can be very good. One of my fondest examples of an avocational scholar was a blacksmith from Evanston, Wyoming, Reed Putnam, who became interested in the question of what was the material from which the golden plates were made. And he became somewhat educated in metallurgical matters, far beyond blacksmithing, and concluded soundly that the material probably was tumbaga, an alloy of silver and copper, of gold and copper, known from Mesoamerica. Avocational scholars don't need to be intimidated. They just need to pick their fields where nobody else is doing anything. Then they are the experts. And that's very much worthwhile. Well, in order to seed a new crop of avocational workers and sympathetic and critical readers on Book of Mormon subjects, there's need for improved communication networks. FAIR and its website and meetings such as this are one of the growing means of spreading the language and the findings of Book of Mormon studies. Think how much LDS literature could benefit from having our own Isaac Asimov or Stephen Gould or Laura Isley. We need people who know the field or fields, subfields, and then can write very well. Some of us are not gifted particularly in both areas. Despite several kinds of problems or obstacles that I can foresee, I'm confident that Book of Mormon studies can become, and is in the process of becoming, an area of increasingly responsible and sophisticated scholarship. And I think that's good. Thank you. In your book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, you document findings near St. Petersburg, Florida, of horse, elephant, and mastodon remains that may possibly be evidence for pre-Columbian horses, elephants, and mastodon populations. What more can you comment on these findings? Fortunately, there is some additional work by others. Wade Miller, a paleontologist at BYU, has, after retirement, has been pursuing the subject of horses in pre-Columbian America and has been able to date bones of horses that have been purported to be before Columbus. After dating something like 25 of those samples from various parts of North and Central America, there are something like 3, possibly 4 of those that do in fact date before the time of Columbus. This is not the time to write an epoch-making paper. It's the time to do more work. And with further samples being suggested where you might go and find bones that are purported to be early, he will be able to make more radiocarbon datings and perhaps eventually make a persuasive case that in fact there were horse bones. And perhaps we need to be a little alert. I have a colleague who is himself an unconventional archaeologist, not Mormon at all, but he had dug at the site of Tula, which many of you know in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico, and he reported to me last week, well, I dug up a horse tooth in the excavations there in the 1960s. I showed it to my supervisor, the chief archaeologist, and he said, oh, that's a modern horse, throw it away. He doesn't know what happened to it, but perhaps if we have enough reports of that odd kind of behavior some more things about animals will be forthcoming. Well, that one's too long for me even to read, let alone to answer. For the Mesoamerican model to work, don't you have to shift the directions by 60 degrees? Read the appendix number 2 in my book, The Geography of Book of Mormon Events. That's 15 pages. This is a very oversimplified question, so I have to give you a simplified answer. Some time ago, I read about a project for a Book of Mormon onomasticon. That's the study of proper names. Do you know the status of this project? Well, yes, there isn't any status. Some work was done, but it has been very difficult for the people with perspectives on Book of Mormon names to mesh their understandings and their feelings and their questions. And they have gone off in several different directions, and there is no unity yet. It's all lone wolfing, so to speak. And I hope that there will be a tendency to get together, because I think that's one of the most exciting possible things. Out of all of the material in the Book of Mormon about ancient life, those names are the largest single body of information. Yet there has been a considerable amount of work that has been done. It just has not been written up and projected for your examination yet. Can you expound on Asherah in 1 Nephi? Where is it found what is said? I'll refer you to the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. Dan, are you here? How long ago was that? 4 years? About 2001 in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, Dan Peterson has an article that makes that accessible to your understanding. But the fact is that there is evidence for Jewish belief that God had a wife. The ancient names and iconography, images. And it appears from things that Nephi says in his expounding his visions that he understood something of that idea and may have been sympathetic with it. It's not altogether definite, but you can read Dan Peterson's article about it and be stimulated. Is there a risk that increased in-depth scholarly study of the Book of Mormon may overshadow or obscure spirit-led enlightenment? Well, I don't know the risk, except on an individual basis. I don't think there's much risk, because I don't think very many people are going to pay attention to the scholarly material. But I hope that those of us who pursue the scholarly materials may protect ourselves against that risk. Historicity of the Book of Mormon. What would you say to those few LDS members who question the historicity of the Book of Mormon due to lack of primary archaeological evidence? I'd say, wait a little while. Read my book. No, I mean the one I'm writing now, my last book. There is a lot of primary archaeological evidence, and it will finally be mustered one of these years. Do you believe the time will come that one's belief in the Book of Mormon will ever be supported through archaeological evidence? Well, for a few people who know enough, it is already. So yes, I think that time may come for some people. It is not an essential by any means. The promise of the Book of Mormon, of course, has been the same ever since it was revealed. Ever since Moroni, there's been no change in that. But we can have additional confidence that we're moving in the right direction with our understanding as scholarship proceeds. I thank you for your attention.